Step out. Now. The words landed cold, sharp enough to cut through the steady hum of the security checkpoint. Conversation slowed. Heads turned. And in that moment, everything seemed to narrow down to one still figure standing beneath the sterile white lights. She didn't move. Not immediately. The woman stood there, composed, her posture straight, her expression unreadable, like she was listening to something far beyond the officer's voice. Officer Daniel Hayes took a step closer, his boots echoing against the polished floor, authority in every movement, the kind that came from years of never being questioned. "You don't belong here," he added, louder this time, making sure everyone within earshot could hear it. A few people shifted uncomfortably. Others watched, curious, drawn in by the tension building in real time. The woman, Naomi Carter, slowly turned her head, her eyes meeting his, calm but unwavering. There was no fear there. No hesitation, just a quiet steadiness that didn't quite match the situation. That alone irritated him. He reached out, not aggressively, but firmly enough to guide her back, to establish control, to remind her who was in charge. "Ma'am, I'm not going to ask again." His voice dropped, more controlled now, but edged with impatience. Around them, phones subtly lifted. Whispers started. You could feel it, the shift from routine to spectacle. Naomi exhaled softly, her gaze sweeping the space for a fraction of a second, as if noting every detail, every face, every exit. Then she looked back at him. "Are you sure you want to do this?" she asked, her voice low, steady, almost thoughtful. It wasn't defiant. It wasn't loud, but it landed heavier than anything he had said. For a split second, something flickered across his face. Confusion, maybe, but it vanished just as quickly. He gave a short, dismissive laugh, shaking his head like he'd heard it all before. "I'm very sure," he replied, already reaching toward his belt, already convinced this was just another routine removal, another person who didn't understand how things worked here. The crowd leaned in, tension tightening like a drawn wire. Naomi didn't resist. She didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. And somehow, that made the moment feel even more charged, like the calm before something no one in that room was prepared for. Because what Officer Hayes didn't know, what none of them knew, was that 3 hours earlier, in a secure room miles away, a single directive had been issued with absolute clarity. No exposure, no mistakes. And standing right in front of him, now, was the one person that order revolved around. The one person he had just decided didn't belong. 3 hours earlier the world had been quiet in a way that most people never noticed. The kind of silence that only existed behind secured doors and coded entry points where every second carried weight and every decision echoed far beyond the room it was made in. Naomi Carter stood at the center of that silence, her posture straight, her presence steady, as a digital map stretched across a wall-sized display in front of her, glowing with layers of data that shifted in real time. There were no raised voices, no dramatic gestures, just controlled movements and measured words, because in that room, precision mattered more than anything else. "We have a narrow window," a voice had said from behind her, calm but firm, the kind of tone that carried authority without needing to announce it. Naomi did not turn right away. Her eyes remained on the screen, absorbing every detail, every variable, every potential risk. "Understood," she replied, her voice even, grounded, leaving no room for doubt. She stepped closer, reaching out to zoom in on a specific location, the same location she would later walk into without hesitation. "Minimal exposure," the voice added. "No deviations." Naomi gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, but enough. She had spent years operating in environments where being seen was the greatest risk, where presence alone could shift outcomes. She knew exactly what was expected, and more importantly, what was at stake. A file had been handed to her then, sealed, marked with a classification level that very few were ever cleared to even look at. She took it without reaction, her expression unchanged, but there was a subtle shift in her eyes, a focus that sharpened, as if everything else around her had faded into the background. "You will not have backup on site," the voice continued. "If anything changes, you adapt." Naomi finally turned, meeting the speaker's gaze with quiet certainty. "I always do," she said, not as a statement of confidence, but as a fact. There was a brief pause, the kind that only happened when everyone in the room understood that nothing more needed to be said. She closed the file, tucked it under her arm, and walked out without looking back, each step deliberate, controlled, carrying the weight of a mission that could not afford mistakes. And now, standing under the harsh lights of a public checkpoint, surrounded by strangers who saw only what they expected to see, that same woman remained just as composed, just as precise, even as the situation unfolded in a way no one there could understand. Because while Officer Hayes saw someone out of place, someone he believed he could control, Naomi saw something entirely different. She saw timing. She saw variables shifting. She saw a moment that could either remain contained or spiral into something far more complicated. Her eyes flicked briefly to the side, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough to confirm what she needed to know. There were movements in the distance, subtle, coordinated, not random. The kind of movement that only trained eyes would catch. She looked back at Hayes, her expression unchanged, her voice calm as ever. "This is your last chance to reconsider," she said quietly, not as a warning filled with emotion, but as a measured statement of fact. Around them, the tension tightened again, the air heavier now, charged with something deeper than curiosity. Because sometimes the most dangerous moment is not when someone raises their voice, but when they do not have to. The air did not move, but everything inside it shifted. Officer Hayes straightened slightly, his confidence still intact, but now laced with something sharper, something that needed to prove itself. "My last chance," he repeated, a faint smile forming, the kind that came from believing he was still in control. Around them, the low hum of the checkpoint seemed to fade as more people slowed their steps, drawn into the tension without fully understanding why. Naomi Carter did not respond immediately. She simply watched him, her gaze steady, her breathing even, as if she were measuring something invisible, something no one else could see. Hayes took that silence as defiance. "You think you can walk in here, ignore protocol, and then tell me what to do?" His voice rose just enough to reclaim attention, to reassert authority in front of the growing crowd. A few murmurs rippled through the space, quiet but present, feeding the moment. Naomi tilted her head slightly, not in challenge, but in quiet observation. "I am not telling you what to do," she said calmly. "I am giving you information you do not have." The words landed differently this time. Not louder, not sharper, but heavier. Hayes hesitated for a fraction of a second, just enough for doubt to try and surface, but he pushed past it quickly, dismissing it with a small shake of his head. "I have everything I need," he replied, reaching again toward his belt, preparing to end what he still believed was a simple situation. But then something interrupted the rhythm he was used to. A sound, subtle at first, a shift in footsteps from the far end of the corridor. Not hurried, not chaotic, coordinated. Naomi heard it before anyone else reacted. Her eyes flicked briefly past Hayes, focusing for less than a second, then returning to him as if nothing had changed. But something had. The energy in the room tightened, like a string pulled too far. Hayes noticed the change in the crowd before he understood the cause. Heads were turning, not toward him anymore, but past him. The murmurs changed tone, less curious now, more uncertain. He glanced over his shoulder, just briefly, and that was enough to break his rhythm. Down the corridor, a small group approached, their movements precise, their presence commanding without a single raised voice. They were not rushing, but they were not slowing down either. Every step carried purpose. Hayes turned back quickly, trying to regain control of the moment, but it had already begun to slip. "Whatever this is, it does not change anything," he said, though his voice no longer carried the same certainty. Naomi looked at him for a long second, and for the first time, there was something different in her expression. Not anger, not satisfaction, just clarity. "It changes everything," she said quietly. The group was close now. Close enough that the insignia on their uniforms caught the light. Close enough that the space around them seemed to shift without a word being spoken. Hayes stepped back, just slightly, not enough for most people to notice, but enough. Because in that moment, the situation was no longer his to control. And for the first time since he had spoken those initial words, he was no longer the one setting the direction of what would happen next. The footsteps did not stop when they reached the edge of the scene. They slowed, controlled, deliberate, and in that slowing, the entire space seemed to shift around them. Conversations died completely. Phones that had been raised just moments ago lowered without anyone realizing it. There was a weight now, something unspoken but undeniable, pressing into every corner of the checkpoint. Officer Hayes felt it before he fully understood it. His posture stiffened, his grip loosening just enough to betray the first crack in his certainty. The lead figure stepped forward, eyes scanning once, taking in everything with practiced precision, then settling on Naomi. No hesitation, no confusion, just recognition. "Ma'am," the man said, his tone respectful, measured, carrying a level of authority that did not need volume to be heard. The word alone landed harder than anything that had been said so far. Hayes blinked, his gaze snapping between the man and Naomi, trying to process the shift happening in front of him. "What is this?" he asked, his voice lower now, no longer performing for the crowd, but searching for footing. The man did not look at him right away. His attention remained on Naomi, waiting, as if her response mattered more than anything else in that moment. Naomi met his gaze briefly and gave a small nod, subtle but clear. Only then did the man turn toward Hayes. "Step back, officer," he said calmly. Not a command shouted across the room, but a directive delivered. With quiet certainty, Hayes did not move immediately. His mind raced, trying to catch up, trying to find a reason to push back, to reclaim control of a situation that had already slipped beyond him. "I am handling this," he replied, though the confidence in his voice had begun to thin. The man's expression did not change. "No," he said simply. "You are not." The words were not aggressive. They were final. Around them, the silence deepened, stretching tight as every person in the room felt the shift but could not yet name it. Naomi stood exactly where she had been from the start, unmoved, unaffected by the tension, as if she had been waiting for this precise moment. Hayes glanced again at the insignia on the uniforms, at the subtle details he had overlooked before, and something inside him began to settle into place. Not comfort, but realization. He took a small step back, almost involuntary, his earlier certainty now replaced by something far more uncertain. The man turned slightly, gesturing toward Naomi with a level of respect that could not be mistaken. "We have been trying to reach you," he said. Naomi's expression remained composed, but there was a faint shift in her eyes, a quiet acknowledgment that everything was now moving exactly as it needed to. "I am aware," she replied. No explanation, no justification, just two words that carried more weight than anything else in the room. Hayes felt it then, fully, the moment slipping entirely out of his hands. Because whatever he thought this situation was, whatever assumptions he had made just minutes ago, they no longer applied. And standing just a few feet away from him was not someone out of place, not someone who needed to be removed, but someone who had never been beneath his authority to begin with. The silence did not break, it deepened, stretching across the checkpoint like something alive, something watching. Officer Hayes stood there, no longer moving, no longer speaking, his earlier authority now hanging in the air like an echo that no one answered. His eyes shifted again to Naomi, but this time, he was not looking at her the same way. The assumptions were gone. In their place was something far more unsettling, uncertainty. The man in front of him, the one who had spoken with quiet authority, stepped slightly to the side, creating space, not for himself, but for her. That single movement said more than any explanation could. Naomi took one step forward. Not rushed, not dramatic, just controlled, measured, like every step had already been decided long before she arrived. The subtle sound of her shoes against the floor seemed louder now, drawing every eye back to her. She did not look at the crowd. She did not acknowledge the tension. Her focus remained clear, precise, directed only where it needed to be. When she stopped, it was not because she had been told to. It was because she chose to. The man beside her straightened slightly, his posture shifting into something more formal, more defined. "Commander Carter," he said, his voice steady, carrying across the space without force. The words landed like a shockwave. Not loud, not explosive, but undeniable. Around them, the reaction was immediate, even if no one spoke it out loud. You could see it in the way people looked at her now, in the way their expressions changed, in the way the air itself seemed to pull back. Hayes did not move at first. His mind caught the title, held on to it, tried to place it somewhere that made sense. Commander. It did not fit with what he had decided just minutes ago. It did not match the version of her he had already created in his mind. And yet, everything around him was confirming it. The man continued, his tone unchanged, as if this had always been the reality. We have a secured transport ready. The situation has been cleared for your movement. Naomi gave a slight nod, acknowledging the statement without needing anything further. She did not explain herself. She did not justify her presence. She simply existed within a level of authority that did not require permission. Hayes swallowed, his voice finally returning, though it came out quieter than before. Commander, he repeated, the word unfamiliar on his tongue now. Naomi turned her head just enough to meet his gaze again. Not with anger, not with triumph, just with clarity. Yes, she said simply. That was all. No raised voice, no extended explanation. But in that one word, everything shifted completely. Because the moment he had tried to control, the situation he believed he understood, was never his to begin with. And now, standing in front of someone whose authority operated far beyond his reach, he was left with nothing but the weight of what he had assumed. The word did not echo, but it stayed, hanging in the air long after it was spoken. Commander. It settled into the space, into the silence, into every person watching who now understood that what they had witnessed was never what it seemed. Officer Hayes felt it settle on him the hardest. His shoulders tightened, not out of defiance, but out of something far more unfamiliar. Awareness, the kind that comes too late. His eyes moved again, slower now, taking in the details he had ignored before. The posture, the composure, the way everyone else adjusted around her without being told. None of it had changed. Only his understanding had. Naomi Carter did not rush to fill the silence. She did not use the moment to assert dominance or demand acknowledgment. She simply stood there, steady as ever, as if the shift in the room was not something she needed to control. Because she did not. It had already happened. The man beside her spoke again, his tone respectful but firm, directed now not just at Hayes, but at the entire space that had witnessed the exchange. This area is now under restricted clearance. Please resume normal operations and clear the pathway. His words were calm, but they carried weight, the kind that did not invite resistance. People began to move almost immediately, not out of fear, but out of instinct, as if something deeper than instruction had told them this moment was no longer theirs to observe. The subtle hum of activity returned, but it was different now, quieter, more cautious. Hayes remained where he was, his feet planted, his earlier authority replaced by hesitation that he could not hide. He opened his mouth slightly, as if to say something, to recover a piece of control, but no words came. Because there was nothing left to claim. Naomi turned slightly, her attention shifting away from him, not dismissive, not cold, simply focused on what mattered next. We are behind schedule, she said, her voice even, directed toward the man who had addressed her. By 4 minutes, he replied, already in step with her pace, already adjusting without question. She nodded once. Then we move now. No raised voice, no dramatic command. And yet, everything responded. Hayes watched as she began to walk past him, close enough that he could see the details he had overlooked before, the quiet precision in her movement, the calm certainty in her presence. For a brief second, their paths aligned, and she paused. Not long, just enough. She turned her head slightly, meeting his gaze one last time. There was no anger there, no satisfaction, just something far more lasting. Understanding. Next time, she said quietly, make sure you see the whole picture. Then she continued forward, her steps never breaking rhythm. Hayes did not follow. He did not speak. He simply stood there, the weight of the moment settling fully now, not as a single mistake, but as something deeper. Around him, the space returned to normal, but it did not feel the same. Because once you realize how wrong you were, there is no going back to what you thought you knew. And as Naomi Carter disappeared beyond the secured corridor, surrounded by those who recognized her authority without question, one truth remained, clear and undeniable. She had never needed to prove who she was. He had only needed to understand it sooner. The corridor swallowed the last trace of her presence, but the impact she left behind did not fade. It lingered, settling into the walls, into the air, into the quiet minds of those who had witnessed everything unfold. Officer Hayes remained frozen for a moment longer, his eyes fixed on the empty space where she had just been, as if expecting something to reverse, something to restore the version of reality he had believed in just minutes earlier. But nothing did. The world did not adjust for him. It moved forward without hesitation. Around him, the checkpoint resumed its rhythm, but it was no longer the same rhythm. Conversations were softer now, movements more deliberate. People no longer looked at him the same way. Some avoided eye contact. Others glanced briefly, then looked away, as if unsure how to process what they had just seen. The authority he had carried so confidently now felt thinner, less certain, like something that had been exposed rather than reinforced. Hayes finally exhaled, a slow breath he had not realized he was holding, and stepped back into his position, though even that felt unfamiliar now. His hands adjusted his uniform instinctively, a subtle attempt to regain structure, to hold on to something steady. But structure without understanding felt hollow. A voice crackled softly through his radio, routine communication, nothing unusual, but even that sounded different to him now. "Status check," the voice said. Hayes paused before responding, his eyes drifting once more toward the secured corridor. "All clear," he replied, though the words felt incomplete the moment he said them. Because what had just happened was not something that fit into routine language. It was not something that could be reduced to a simple report. A second officer nearby shifted closer, hesitant, uncertain how to approach. "What was that?" he asked quietly, not accusatory, just confused. Hayes did not answer right away. He could have said anything. He could have simplified it, dismissed it, reshaped it into something easier to carry. But he did not. "Someone important," he said finally, his voice lower, more measured than before. It was not the full truth, but it was the closest thing he had to it. The other officer nodded slowly, absorbing the answer, though it was clear he sensed there was more beneath it. Hayes watched as the flow of people continued, as new faces passed through without knowledge of what had just taken place. And for the first time, he saw it differently. Not as a system he controlled, but as a space filled with variables he had never fully considered. His earlier certainty, the quick judgments, the assumptions that had once felt automatic, now sat heavy in his mind. Because they had not just been wrong, they had been incomplete. An incomplete understanding had consequences he could not ignore anymore. He straightened again, but this time, it was different. Not a display of authority, but a quiet reset, a subtle shift in how he carried himself. Not perfect, not immediate, but present. Because some lessons do not arrive with noise or force. They arrive in silence, in a single moment that changes how you see everything that comes after. And as the checkpoint continued its steady rhythm, one truth remained, steady and unshaken beneath it all. Power does not always announce itself. Sometimes, it simply waits for you to recognize it. Time did not slow, but for Officer Hayes, it no longer moved the same way. Every sound, every movement around him seemed sharper, more defined, as if something inside him had shifted its focus. The routine that once felt automatic now demanded attention. The next person stepped forward in line, a middle-aged man holding a small travel bag, offering his identification with a polite nod. Hayes reached out to take it, his motion steady, but there was a pause this time, brief but real. He looked at the man, not just at the document in his hand, but at the person standing in front of him. It was subtle, almost invisible to anyone watching, but it was there. The man noticed it too, just slightly, a flicker of surprise in his expression before he relaxed again. "Thank you," Hayes said, his voice controlled, measured, not forced, just different. The man nodded and moved along. Another person stepped forward. Then another. The line continued, the flow uninterrupted, but the space itself felt altered, as if something had been recalibrated beneath the surface. A quiet awareness lingered, not just in Hayes, but in those who had seen what happened earlier. They carried it with them in the way they moved, in the way they watched, in the way they understood that not everything was as simple as it appeared. Hayes adjusted his stance again, this time not out of habit, but out of intention. His gaze lifted slightly, scanning not just for compliance, but for context. The details he once overlooked now stood out. The way someone held themselves, the way they responded, the way they moved through the space. It was no longer about control. It was about understanding. His radio crackled. Again, another routine update, another voice reminding him that the system continued, unchanged on the surface. But he knew better now. Systems were only as accurate as the people operating within them. and assumptions, once made too quickly, could distort everything. The officer beside him spoke again, quieter this time, almost thoughtful. You ever seen something like that before? Hayes kept his eyes forward, watching the next person approach, considering the question carefully. No, he said after a moment. But I should have. It was not regret in his voice. It was recognition. The difference mattered. Because regret looks backward. Recognition changes what comes next. The line moved forward again, steady, consistent, each person stepping into the same space, but not the same moment. Hayes continued his work, but now there was a rhythm to it that felt grounded, intentional, aware. Not perfect, not flawless, but present. And somewhere beyond the secured corridor, far from the checkpoint, Naomi Carter continued moving forward as well, her mission uninterrupted, her presence never dependent on recognition to exist. The world did not pause for her, and she did not need it to. Because real authority does not wait to be acknowledged. It operates regardless. Back at the checkpoint, Hayes watched another person step forward, and this time, there was no rush, no assumption, no need to prove anything. Just a quiet understanding that every moment held more than what appeared on the surface. And sometimes, the difference between control and clarity is a single moment that forces you to see what was always there. The hours moved forward, but the earlier moment refused to disappear completely. It did not interrupt the flow of the checkpoint, but it lingered beneath it, shaping the way Officer Hayes now saw everything in front of him. The line continued, steady and predictable, people stepping forward one by one, each carrying their own purpose, their own destination, their own story that he could not see at a glance. And that was the difference now. He knew he could not see it all. A woman approached, holding a folder close to her chest, her expression focused, slightly tense. Hayes took her identification, his movements calm, deliberate. He glanced at the document, then back at her, not searching for fault, but for understanding. You are heading to Terminal C? He asked, his tone neutral. She nodded quickly, a bit surprised by the question, but answered clearly. Yes, sir. He handed the identification back, without hesitation. You are good to go. She gave a small, relieved smile, and moved on. It was a simple interaction. Nothing dramatic. Nothing worth remembering to anyone else. But to Hayes, it marked something important. The absence of assumption. The presence of awareness. Nearby, the other officer watched him for a moment, noticing the change, even if he could not fully explain it. You are different today, he said quietly, almost more to himself than to Hayes. Hayes did not look over. His eyes remained forward, tracking the movement of the line. I am paying attention, he replied. The answer was simple, but it carried weight. Because attention meant slowing down just enough to see what was actually there, not what he expected to see. The radio buzzed again, this time with a more formal tone. All units, maintain heightened awareness. Secure operations are active in adjacent zones. Hayes listened carefully, the words connecting immediately to what he had witnessed earlier. This was not random. This was part of something larger, something structured, something precise. He acknowledged the message with a short response, his voice steady. Copy that. As the line continued, his mind did not drift. It stayed present, grounded in each interaction, each detail. A man with a heavy suitcase. A young couple speaking quietly to each other. An older traveler moving more slowly than the rest. None of them were problems. None of them were assumptions waiting to happen. They were simply people moving through a system that required clarity, not control. And somewhere beyond his view, behind layers of secured access and controlled movement, Naomi Carter was still moving forward, her mission unfolding without interruption, her presence influencing outcomes far beyond what anyone at the checkpoint could imagine. Hayes did not need to see it to understand it. That was the lesson. Not everything important announces itself. Not everything powerful stands out at first glance. Sometimes, it passes right in front of you, calm, quiet, and completely certain of its place in the world. And if you are not paying attention, you will miss it. Hayes took a slow breath, steadying himself, not because he was uncertain, but because he was aware now. Aware that every moment held more than what appeared on the surface. Aware that authority without understanding was incomplete. And as another person stepped forward, he met them with that same quiet clarity, knowing that the difference between who he was before and who he was becoming came down to one simple choice. to see, before deciding what something meant. The pattern held, steady and controlled, but beneath it something continued to evolve. Officer Hayes no longer moved through his role on instinct alone. Each action now carried intention, each decision shaped by a quiet awareness that had not been there before. The checkpoint lights reflected off polished floors, the same as they always had, but the environment felt sharper, more defined, as if the details themselves had become louder. A man stepped forward, dressed in a dark business suit, his posture confident, his movements quick. He handed over his identification without a word. Hayes took it, his eyes scanning the document briefly, then lifting to meet the man's gaze. There was no rush in his movement, no need to assert control through speed or tone. Purpose of travel? Hayes asked calmly. The man responded immediately, conference in Dallas. Hayes nodded once, returning the identification. You are good to go. The man moved on without hesitation. Another person stepped forward, then another, the rhythm continuing, but now it was anchored in something deeper than routine. It was anchored in clarity. Nearby, the same officer who had spoken earlier leaned slightly closer, his voice low enough to stay between them. You think that was planned? He asked, referring to what had happened before. Hayes did not answer immediately. His eyes followed the line, watching the next person approach, considering the question fully before speaking. Everything like that is planned, he said quietly. We just do not always see the plan. The officer nodded slowly, absorbing the thought, then stepped back into his position. Hayes continued forward, his focus steady, his movements precise. The radio buzzed again, this time with a brief update, something about secured transit clearing the adjacent zone. Hayes listened carefully, connecting the message to what he now understood. This was not just a single moment earlier. It was part of a larger operation, something structured, something intentional, something that moved beyond the small space he controlled. And for the first time, that realization did not unsettle him. It grounded him, because it reminded him that his role was not to control everything, but to handle what was in front of him with clarity. A young traveler stepped forward, hesitating slightly, adjusting the strap of a backpack. Hayes noticed it immediately, the small detail that might have gone ignored before. Take your time, he said, his tone even. The traveler nodded, relaxing just enough to move forward without tension. It was a small moment, almost invisible, but it mattered, because clarity was not just about recognizing power. It was about recognizing people. As the line continued, Hayes felt the shift settle into something stable, something lasting. Not a reaction to one moment, but a change in how he operated moving forward. The checkpoint remained the same on the surface, but for him, it was no longer just a place of control. It was a place of responsibility, shaped by awareness, guided by understanding. And somewhere far beyond his reach, Naomi Carter continued moving through her mission, unseen by most, but never out of place. Because real authority does not need to be announced to be effective. It operates quietly, precisely, and without hesitation. Hayes watched another person step forward, meeting them with that same steady presence, knowing now that every moment carried more than what appeared, and that the difference between misunderstanding and clarity was simply the willingness to see what was actually there. The rhythm of the checkpoint had settled into something steady, something controlled, but beneath that surface, a quiet transformation continued to take shape. Officer Hayes no longer reacted to movement alone. He observed. He listened. He processed. Each person who stepped forward was no longer just part of a line, but part of a larger picture that demanded attention rather than assumption. A woman approached with 2 small carry-on bags, her pace slightly hurried, her eyes scanning the area as if she was already behind schedule. Hayes noticed the detail immediately, not as suspicion, but as context. Take a breath, he said calmly, his tone even, grounded. She paused for a second, surprised, then nodded, her shoulders relaxing just enough to regain control of her movement. Thank you, she replied quietly. Hayes checked her identification and handed it back without delay. You are good to go. She moved forward, more composed than before. It was a small moment, but it carried weight. Because awareness was not just about preventing mistakes. It was about creating clarity where there could have been tension. The officer beside him watched again, this time with more understanding than before. You are not just checking documents anymore, he said. Hayes kept his eyes forward. I never was, he replied. The difference now was that he understood it. The radio came alive once more, but this time the tone was different, more formal, more deliberate. All units, be advised, strategic operation has cleared primary zone. Maintain professionalism and discretion. Hayes listened carefully, the words aligning with everything he had already begun to realize. Strategic operation. Primary zone. It confirmed what he had felt earlier, but could not yet name. This had never been random. It had been precise from the start, and he had stepped into it without understanding the full picture. He acknowledged the message quietly, his voice steady. Understood. As the line continued, he found himself more present than ever before, not distracted, not reactive, but fully engaged in each moment. A young man stepped forward, adjusting his jacket, his expression neutral but slightly guarded. Hayes took the identification, meeting his gaze briefly, not to challenge, but to acknowledge. "You are all set," he said, handing it back with a small nod. The young man hesitated for a fraction of a second, then nodded in return, something unspoken passing between them before he moved on. It was subtle, but it mattered, because respect, once given without assumption, has a way of changing how people respond. The flow of the checkpoint continued, unchanged on the surface, but internally, everything felt different. Hayes no longer saw his role as a position of control, but as a responsibility shaped by awareness, guided by understanding, grounded in the ability to see beyond the immediate. And somewhere beyond the walls of that checkpoint, far from the line of travelers and routine exchanges, Naomi Carter had already moved into the next phase of her mission, her presence never needing validation, her authority never dependent on recognition. Hayes did not need to witness it to know it was happening. That was the difference now. He understood that the world operated on layers he could not always see, and that his role was not diminished by that fact, but defined by how well he handled what was in front of him. As another traveler stepped forward, Hayes met them with that same steady clarity, knowing that every moment carried weight, and that the ability to recognize what mattered did not come from power alone, but from the willingness to see the full picture before making a decision. The checkpoint had fully stabilized into its new rhythm, but something about the air had changed in a way that could not be reversed. Officer Hayes could feel it in the smallest details, in the way people no longer moved with simple routine, but with quiet awareness, as if they too had sensed that not everything in this place was as ordinary as it once seemed. Each traveler stepping forward was still just a traveler on the surface, but now Hayes saw beyond that surface more clearly than before. A man approached with a calm expression, holding his identification ready before being asked. Hayes accepted it, his movements smooth and deliberate. "Purpose of visit?" he asked evenly. "Business meeting." The man replied. Hayes nodded, scanning the document, then returned it. "You are good to go." The exchange was simple, efficient, but no longer mechanical. It carried intention. It carried understanding. The man moved on without hesitation, and Hayes felt the continuation of something steady, something balanced. The officer beside him glanced over again, this time with a quieter tone. "Things feel different now," he said. Hayes did not look away from the line. "They are not different," he replied after a moment. "I am just noticing them properly now." The statement was not dramatic. It was not an admission of failure. It was recognition of growth, a subtle but permanent shift in how he engaged with his role. The radio crackled once more, the tone now final, precise, without ambiguity. "All units, secure operations concluded. Maintain standard procedures and resume normal flow." Hayes listened carefully, absorbing the message fully. Secure operations concluded. It confirmed what he had already begun to understand. What had passed through this checkpoint was not random, not accidental, not routine. It had been part of something structured, something deliberate, something far beyond his initial perception. He responded with a calm acknowledgment. "Copy that." The flow of people continued, uninterrupted, steady, but now Hayes saw it differently. Each person was still just themselves, but each interaction held more depth than before. A woman stepped forward holding a boarding pass, slightly anxious. Hayes noticed it immediately. "You are in the correct lane," he said gently. The woman blinked, surprised by the reassurance, then nodded with visible relief. "Thank you," she said before moving on. It was a small interaction, but it reflected something larger. Awareness creates stability where assumption creates tension. And Hayes understood that now in a way he had not before. His posture remained steady, but his perspective had changed completely. No longer reactive, no longer dependent on surface judgment, but grounded in observation and clarity. And beyond the checkpoint, beyond the structured movement of travelers and controlled access points, Naomi Carter had already completed the phase that intersected with this space. Her presence no longer needed to be acknowledged here because it had already achieved its purpose elsewhere. Hayes did not think of her with confusion anymore. He thought of her with understanding, not as someone who disrupted his world, but as someone who revealed the limits of how he had been seeing it. As another traveler stepped forward, Hayes met them with the same steady calm, fully present, fully aware, no longer operating on assumption but on understanding, knowing now that clarity was not about control, but about seeing people and situations exactly as they were, without distortion. The checkpoint had settled into a steady rhythm that no longer felt unfamiliar, but something deeper had permanently changed in the way Officer Hayes experienced it. The flow of people, the movement of documents, the sound of brief exchanges, all of it remained exactly as it had been at the beginning of the day, yet none of it felt the same anymore. There was a quiet awareness now, a sense that every interaction carried meaning beyond the surface. Hayes stood at his position, posture upright, eyes calm, fully present in a way that was no longer reactive but intentional. A final traveler approached, holding a passport and boarding pass together, their expression calm but slightly tired, like someone who had been through a long journey already. Hayes accepted the documents, reviewed them carefully, then looked up. "You are cleared," he said evenly. The traveler nodded, offering a brief thank you before moving on. It was simple, clean, no hesitation, no disruption. But in that simplicity, something final had settled. The system was still the same. The structure had not changed, but the way he understood it had been completely rewritten. The officer beside him exhaled slowly, shifting his weight slightly as the pace of the checkpoint began to ease. "So that is it," he said quietly, more as reflection than question. Hayes did not answer immediately. He looked down the line, now shorter, less dense, the urgency of earlier moments replaced by steady order. "No," Hayes finally said. "That was only what we were allowed to see." The words were calm, not dramatic, but they carried weight. Because understanding had replaced confusion and clarity had replaced assumption. The radio on his shoulder gave a final brief tone, then silence followed. Not a command, not an update, just an end to the operational cycle that had defined the earlier tension of the day. Hayes acknowledged it without speaking, then returned his attention forward. The checkpoint continued, but now it was just what it had always been meant to be. A passage point, a space of movement, not a stage for judgment, but a structure for flow. And somewhere beyond what he could see from his position, Naomi Carter's presence no longer needed confirmation, explanation, or visibility within this environment. Her role had already completed its intersection with this place. What remained was the outcome of it. Hayes adjusted his stance one final time, not out of habit, but out of resolution. He understood now that authority was not defined by control over people, but by the ability to recognize truth when it appeared without warning. And more importantly, to act with clarity when it mattered. As the final travelers moved through and the line disappeared, the checkpoint returned fully to normal operations. But for Hayes, nothing returned to what it had been before. Because once you have seen beyond assumption, you do not go back to it. You simply move forward differently. And in that quiet return to routine, the only thing that remained was understanding, steady and permanent, shaping everything that would come next.